Hello, hello, and welcome to our webinar with the latest updates on climate finance. It's less than 1 week to come, and that's why maybe loads of you are joining us. Welcome, and I'm really excited that I have Barbara Buchner with me. Barbara is the Executive Director of the Climate Finance Program at the Climate Policy Initiative, and has been a key expert in the field for years. I'm really happy that she joins us because she really has some of the latest updates on climate finance, the latest numbers which just came out. So Barbara, how did you actually get into climate finance? How does someone get into climate finance?
Very good question, and thanks first of all for having me here. I'm really excited to be able to share some of our work with you, in particular our most recent insights on the climate finance landscape that we have just published. So it's exciting for me. How did I get to climate finance? It's a long story. I did grow up in Austria. I'm very, very conscious about climate change and environment more generally. So I was always very mission driven to, kind of help save the world and help in a way kind of do something that can help save our planet for our future generations. And I did want to take an approach that really thinks about how we can get more the mainstream actors into this area. So I studied economics, and after a few years realized that really if you want to make sure that you set the right incentives for climate action to happen and for us to getting on a low carbon climate resilient pathway, you really need to think about how you can make the investments happen, because in the end, how the investments are really kind of the backbone of allowing us to getting us on a low carbon climate resilient pathway, because without the right investment, we will just not be able to get and to make the right changes in our economies and really kind of shift towards a different business model for every one of us. So I started Climate Policy Initiative with our founder Tom Heller in 2009, and that was just after the Copenhagen COP, and obviously the 100 billion figure was everywhere and no one really understood what climate finance was. So I decided to focus the program that I was building up on climate finance and really understanding, what does it mean? How can we really understand better how much money is flowing, but also how to scale up climate finance. So it's been a long journey. I've been excited about all the progress we've made, but I think we still have also lots of challenges that we need to face. So I look forward to sharing some of our work today, and then hopefully collaborating with many of those who are on the line today and who are following us.
Awesome. Wow. Yeah, that already kind of led to what I have to announce right now, that all of you can ask questions either on the side. When you're watching live on YouTube, you have a section where you can comment and ask questions about, well, anything related to this presentation or questions you have on climate finance. You can also tweet at us and use the hashtag #ClimateTweeter or Twitter @ClimateTracking. Or we have a Facebook event for this, so you can also ask your question right there. So really kind of at the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions. So really, if you have something that's really interesting for you or you're really important for you to understand even better, then raise your questions. But for now, I'm really excited to give the word back to you and get into your presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And yes, let's jump right into the substance. And so just to give you an overview, what I would like to cover today in the presentations are 3 areas. First, I'll provide some of the key insights from the state of play in climate finance, really looking at how much money is flowing, what has changed in recent years, what are some of the key trends that we slowly start identifying, whether or not we are on track, and also a kind of a brief outlook going forward. Next, I'd like to share one of the key solutions for scaling up more investments to address climate change, which are new investment vehicles, and really thinking outside of the box towards kind of more innovative solutions that can help really getting us on the right pathway. And then finally, obviously, I'd be very happy to take your questions. And also for, obviously, I will be remain also available for those of you who are interested in more information after this webinar. So with that, let me jump into kind of my presentation. But before going on the climate finance details and really the latest insights, I would like to give you a little background on my organization's work, Climate Policy Initiative's work. We are a think tank focused on improving the most important energy and land use practices around the world. And how do we do that? We do that by helping governments, businesses, and financial institutions to deploy policies and financial instruments that are needed to grow sustainable development and combat climate change at the same time. The climate finance program that I am leading has three primary business lines. The first one is the state of finance, where we really look at understanding the current status of investment that is related to climate change, but also understand what's the trends in investment and what are some of the barriers for current investors in the area. The second business line is around effective finance, where we really try to understand how policy and public finance can really most effectively have an impact, unlock impact, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time mobilize private capital. And we do that by looking, for example, at lessons from in-depth project case studies and really kind of interacting very closely with a wide range of investors to understand their needs. And then the final one, which I will share some insights on today in the webinar later, is transformative finance, where, as I said before, we really kind of think about outside of the box and we try to develop and scale transformative solutions for unlocking effective finance for sustainable development around the world. So with that, let me just get started a little bit on the state of play in climate finance and also give you a little bit the background of why we are tracking climate finance. And I think what we see is that there are two key challenges that we face in the 21st century. The first one, obviously, is climate change. We all know, and I think we just had a study coming out today from the UN, that emissions are currently on path for being dangerous to future generations. And that certainly is something which we need to kind of change, and therefore we need to understand of how we're doing compared to the needs that we have of changing this pathway. And the second challenge is that we need to address, in addition to climate change, the urgent development needs to end poverty, to alleviate world hunger, and address a number of development changes and challenges that are embodied best by the UN United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see them here on the slides, the various number of the goals that are relevant in this area. So these, for us, are kind of the key reasons of why we think we need to better understand of how we are doing in terms of climate finance, because climate finance at its heart is really about tracking investment to address all these challenges. So where do we stand compared to our climate goals? And please don't get scared by this graph here. This is our famous spaghetti graph, and I'm very excited actually to just share this with you today for the first time. We just launched today our Global Landscape of Climate Finance 2017 report. So I'm excited to share some of our key findings with you. And this spaghetti diagram, which you can see here, presents in a snapshot the most recent estimates on global annual climate finance flows. So what it does is that it presents finance flows along their life cycle, from the sources on the left side through the intermediaries to the instruments that are being applied, and the recipients and final end users on the right side. And we also kind of track where the geographies, where the money actually ends up. Just for context, CPI has pioneered the first assessment of global climate finance flows back in 2011, and we have continued to improve and refine our methodology and our spaghetti graph over time, just to ensure that we really provide the most comprehensive assessment of investment to address climate change. The report that we launched today updates the most comprehensive assessment of annual climate finance flows with data from 2015 and 2016, providing for the first time a 5-year trend analysis on the globally trends that we can identify in order to really also show what are the gaps and the opportunities to scale up investment. And just as a side note here, as with our previous reports, the figures that we identify in our landscape represent the overall global finance flows and should not be compared with the amounts that may count towards the 100 billion per year that developed countries committed to mobilize to assist developing countries, but it should rather be compared with the total investment that is needed in order to limit the global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius. So let me just jump into some of the key findings from our recent study and show you the overall trend of where we are in terms of climate investments. So what you can see here is that our 2070 edition shows that climate investment increased to 410 billion US dollars per year on average over 2015 and 2016, which is a 12% increase from the comparable numbers in 2013 and 2014. And this is driven particularly by an increased private investment in renewable energy. Just a little bit more background, our analysis shows that global climate finance increased 13% in 2015 to a record high of 437 billion, then came down again by 12% in 2016 to 383 billion. But as I said, taking into account the annual fluctuations, the annual average flows across the 2015-2016 period were still 12% higher than during the 2013-2014 period. The record in 2015 was mainly driven by renewable energy flows, particularly in China, the US, and Japan. And even though technology costs continue to fall, which obviously is a very welcome development, which leads in turn to a lower investment needed, the amount of the new projects was still very strong. Instead, the decrease in 2016 was due to a combination of both falling technology costs, but also lower capacity additions in some countries. As I said, the technology costs decreased an average of 10% between 2015 and 2016, with particular decreases from solar energy. But at the same time, in 2016, what we could see is that new capacity additions slowed down, particularly in China, which saw a scheduled phase down in revenue for support for the wind projects, and also greater emphasis on grid integration for existing capacity. So that's the main reasons. Let me just give you a little bit more details on the trends here. On this slide, what you can see is that public finance continues to be the engine behind the climate finance architecture, with a steady share over the last years, and really kind of being the engine and like the driving force behind unlocking higher amounts of private finance. And you can see that when you look at the private finance figures, where we have been able to identify that the private sector is doing more than ever, which is a good sign, as we all know that we need significant private investment to close the overinvestment gap of getting us towards a 2 degrees future. Just a little bit more background here, private sector investment grew to 68% of total climate finance in 2015, before dropping back to 63% in 2016. But I think more generally, the trend that we were able to detect is that this increased private sector activity is clearly a sign of maturing markets for wind and solar, which require therefore less support from the public sector to drive greater private investment. Obviously, one question that we posed ourselves and which we've heard from many in our community is whether there was a Paris effect on the investment trends related to climate action. So we were really interested in seeing whether there was an effect from the government actions in the lead up to the Paris Agreement for the surge that we saw in the finance figures in 2015. And what we could see is that the increase in overall finance in 2015 was not due to the major scale-up of public finance, but rather due to an increase in private finance as falling renewable costs, but also continued strong policy environments led to record investments. So I think this is again kind of emphasizing one of the findings that we have been stressing over the last years, which is that getting domestic enabling environments right continues to play a major role to attract investment, and the Paris Agreement certainly has given a strong signals to governments in this context. In addition, what we could see is that there were some signals that momentum may have made a small difference, including new direct investments by institutional investors, which may have been mobilized through the various investor engagement initiatives that were established in the run-up to the Paris agreements. And then finally, what we also could see in this context of the Paris effect is that 43 governments committed to 10.3 billion US dollars to the Green Climate Fund before the end of 2015. And as a result, what we have now is that actually 54 projects have been financed for a total of 2.6 billion US dollars by October 2017, replacing much needed low cost and risk taking capital as other climate funds reduced their spending. Of course, with the US administration reducing its commitment, this has dropped a little bit. It has dropped to 8.3 billion US dollars, but still it is a significant figure. So let me just come back a little bit and understand of where we are standing. So whether the money that is currently flowing is actually, coming close to the needs that we have. What you can see on this slide here is that with at least 400 billion US dollars invested in 2015, 2016, we know that more climate finance than ever flowed, and that is good news, particularly in a few sectors in the energy area. You can see here that we had actually 2 record-breaking years for renewable energy that give some very strong suggestions that the capacity additions and the investment for some of the renewable energy technologies are on track. And this slide here shows that actually the overall investment in solar PV and in onshore wind specifically has led to deployment levels that mean that they are actually on track to meet the requirements that the International Energy Agency has set out to give us a really good chance of limiting global temperature rise to 2 degrees. And as I mentioned before already, this is due particularly to both the rising investments in these technologies, but also the strongly falling technology costs, which mean that for every dollar that you invest, you actually get a higher capacity addition and higher deployment. So obviously, this is what we would be looking for. What we also could see in our trends is actually some interesting shifts in priorities from the public finance sector. We see that as renewable energy has become more commercially viable, the energy efficiency is now the leading focus of public investment in mitigation. And this suggests that the public sector is shifting to a critical role in overcoming the hurdles to realize the significant potential of energy efficiency, as has kind of been stressed over the last years. The energy efficiency sector has received 35% of public mitigation flows over the period of 2015 and 2016, compared to 24% over the 2013-2014 period. On the other hand, as I already indicated, the public spending on renewable energy decreased. It decreased by 11 billion US dollars on average, and by 9 percentage points from the 2013-2014 period to the 2015-2016 period, while private investments for renewable energy increased. And this suggests that renewable energy really is becoming a commercial investment choice in more markets, and this again is a very positive signal. Just as an additional insight, kind of a new trend that we have seen, which I think again is very positive of helping us getting on a low carbon pathway, we have seen that sustainable transport saw an increase in average annual investments from 90 billion US dollars from the 2013-2014 period to 22 billion US dollars in the 2015-2016 period. But obviously, while these are all kind of positive signs, I think we still need to, take a step back and really understand of whether we are on track and whether these positive success stories really allow us to make the conclusion that we are doing quite well in compared to the needs that we have of getting towards the 2 degrees future. And if you look again backwards, and again, as I said, we have at least 410 billion US dollars invested in 2015, 2016. We know more climate finance than ever flowed. But we also know that we are still falling far short of the needs to limit the increase of global temperature to 2 degrees. And I think this is what I'd like to emphasize here. The renewable energy, which is one of the main success stories here, is just one part of one sector across the economy where investment is needed. And even for the energy sector, including energy use in power and transportation and buildings, the needs actually total over $1 trillion per year through 2015, according to the International Energy Agency. But more is needed in agriculture, in forestry, in water, and in ways to enable low carbon transition. And adaptation finance needs are certainly pressing in order to minimize the costs of climate impacts that are already locked in. In addition, and as you can see on the slide here, I think it is important to note that fossil fuel investments overall still dwarfed climate investments. The slide here shows estimates again by the International Energy Agency that total upstream and downstream fossil fuel investment in 2016 amounted to $825 billion. And this not only decreases the effectiveness of climate investment, but it also introduces risks to the financial system, as, for example, oil or coal assets could become stranded assets. So what we need is clearly a shift from brown to green, redirecting capital from traditional to sustainable activities. That said, I obviously would not want to kind of keep you only on the negative side here. I think what we have seen in our work is also a number of promising trends for the outlook going forward. And I think the first one I'd like to make here is that while the impacts from the Paris Agreement haven't been seen directly in the numbers yet, the Paris Agreement does mean that the majority of nations are working to implement climate plans, many of which also include investment pathways. As you might have read, if you've looked into the Paris Agreement, the Article 2.1c includes a long-term ambition to make financial flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And the articulation of this long-term and systematic finance goal in an international agreement can really bring the focus to efforts to engage financial system actors, as well as efforts to ensure that domestic governmental spending as a whole is consistent with the 2 degrees pathway. I think the second positive trend that we see is that there is a number of initiatives that engage broader capital markets, the financial system, and large cooperation to align with low carbon climate resilient development. There's tools, investment criteria, and framework to assist investors to embed low carbon climate resilient business practices. They're becoming much more commonplace. And just to mention a couple of them, there is, for example, 300 corporations that have committed to set science-based targets on their emissions profile in line with the 2 degrees scenarios to assist investors in assessing their low carbon commitments. There is obviously very importantly the task force on climate related financial disclosure established by the Financial Stability Board, which launched its final report in June 2017, emphasizing again the need for investors and asset managers to implement scenario analysis in assessing the physical and the transition risks to climate change, as well as opportunities to create investor value over the long term. And then there's also the implementation of Article 173 for French-based investors that require reporting on portfolio alignment with low carbon transitions, which again underscores the potential for more active regulatory environments governing the asset allocation by investors. I think the third positive trend that I'd like to mention is efforts to green existing public financial systems, which are really beginning to take root, though obviously more work remains. But what we've seen is that since 2011, efforts by public finance institutions have contributed to greater transparency and clarity on levels of funding for climate resilient versus dirty investment. However, obviously, sectors in need of significant adaptive capacity to climate impacts, such as water supply, agriculture, and general infrastructure, require greater focus. And so there is more work that is needed. And in addition, as I also mentioned before, fossil fuel technologies continue to receive public funding and subsidies, canceling therefore some of the progress that we're making on the green side. On that note, I'd just very briefly like to mention a recent study by CPI and the Inter-American Development Bank that explored the role of national development banks, specifically in Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. And again, what we have seen in our more general work is that national financial institutions really are key in helping to scale up investments. And in this study, we found that these banks are indeed mobilizing significant amounts of finance today, actually more than 11 billion US dollars, but that most of this actually went to towards mitigation sectors and predominantly in the energy space. So in order for these national banks to best support implementation of their country's climate goals, we believe that greater insight into climate finance tracking will be needed. And it will also be critical to increase the coordination between governments and these national banks and to pilot new and innovative blending financing mechanisms to scale up the needed investments in climate sectors, particularly for adaptation. And I think this brings me actually very nicely to the fourth positive trend that we can see, which is related to new and innovative financial innovation vehicles that are on the rise. And what we can see that many of these new transformative vehicles really target institutional investors that manage mostly untapped but very significant portions of the global capital. And so we certainly see a big potential to kind of attract these investors into the mainstream climate activities. So just on this note, let me actually speak very briefly of some of the most promising new investment vehicles and also initiatives out there, because again, just to sum up the kind of the parts of our kind of tracking work, what we have seen is that the general trends, the longer term trends in climate investments are positive. But at the same time, we do know that we are falling far short of the needs in order of getting us towards long-term pathway towards 2 degrees Celsius, and therefore tapping the private sector and coming up with innovative solutions that really require more thinking outside of the box are critical in order to address some of these current investment gaps. So the one initiative that I would like to briefly mention to you, and where I'd like to mention a couple of the instruments that we have developed today in our webinar here, is the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. CPI manages this initiative, the lab, as well as a number of regional offshoots for Brazil and for India. And their overall goal of this lab is really to unlock private investment at scale for sustainable development in emerging economies. How does it do that? The lab brings together public and private actors to address some of the persistent investment barriers by identifying, developing, stress testing, and supporting sustainable finance instruments that really can drive billions to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. Just to give you a little bit more of the background here, the lab runs in annual cycles to develop instruments. It is comprised of senior high-level experts in climate finance, and you can see on this slide here the members that we have been managing to get into our labs, who are actually the ones who guide the work and who are really kind of the ones who help identify what are the promising solutions that are out there in order to really scale climate investments. So the members include representatives from governments, from pension funds, from investment banks, from development finance institutions, and like more kind of mainstream financial actors around the world, including from, for example, from BlackRock, but also from a number of foundations that have been very active in supporting the lab, including the Rockefeller Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Oak Foundation, Beckett Foundation, and the Shakti Foundation, together with a number of donor governments from the US, the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany. CPI acts as the secretariat for the lab, and we provide analytical support, but also the convening of the labs. And what we do is that we open every year an international call for ideas for innovative, transformative financial solutions to address sustainable development and climate change problems. The lab members, again, the ones you can see here on the slide, select the most promising ideas based on specific criteria, and CPI analysts, together with an expert working group, group developed then the idea over the course of the year before the lab members finally endorse their ideas if their development has been successful, and we also help them to facilitate the fundraising for the specific pilots of these ideas. Just in a nutshell, what have we managed to achieve up to date since its launch in 2014? We have actually, which is just in roughly over 3 years, Lab Ideas have mobilized $977 million for concrete pilot projects in sustainable energy, in land use, and in adaptation across the world, with investment coming both from the public and the private side. So it did manage to achieve its original goals of really unlocking private investment. Lab members themselves have invested more than $220 million. And we have also managed to get endorsement by the G7, and the lab's model has expanded from operating at the global level to now also operating as a Brazil and an India lab with endorsement from the Brazil and Indian governments. Just as a side note, we are currently accepting submissions for innovative ideas for our new next 2017-2018 cycle, and we obviously would encourage you to spread the word on this call for ideas, and also make sure that if you have any ideas, if you have any thoughts on what could really help to address some of the barriers in the market, to look at our website and to really help us kind of come up with some new solutions in this space. And before closing, let me just give you a couple of quick examples to give you a better insight of what we are doing in the lab and what types of financial solutions we are developing. So the first examples that I'd like to share with you is Climate Investor One, which is an example of our lab instruments that was endorsed in the first cycle in 2015. And this lab instrument combines 3 investment funds into one facility to finance renewable energy projects at specific stages of the project life cycle. At an early project stage, Climate Investor One provides financial, technical, environmental, social development, and structuring support through a development fund. Climate Investor One then reduces the complexity associated with multi-party negotiations by equity financing a large part of construction through a construction equity fund. And once the project is operational, Climate Investor One mobilizes long-term debt financing through a refinancing fund with the objective of optimizing the financing over the operational life of the project. Climate Investor One aims to catalyze significant new investment in renewable energy and developing countries and grow renewable energy pipelines. And we are very happy to announce that it has already closed $412 million in initial investments so far. Just a very different example, again, to show you kind of the breadth of different ideas and sectors we're covering in the lab, is CRAFT, the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance and Technology Transfer Facility. CRAFT is an example of an adaptation-focused instrument that was just endorsed by the lab in our most recent cycle in September of this year. And CRAFT, as a growth equity fund, will invest in 10 to 20 companies which have proven technologies and solutions for climate resilience. They will be located in both developed and developing countries, and they will have demonstrated market potential. Through its investments, the fund will help companies like water and weather analytics, catastrophic risk modeling, drip irrigation, and drought-resistant crop companies expand into new sectors and territories and transfer technologies from developed to developing countries. I think what we've managed to show is that for every $1 of concessional financing and technical assistance grants, CRAFT will be able to leverage $3.3 of direct commercial investments to enhance the resilience of communities, of businesses, and of critical infrastructure. We are currently supporting CRAFT in its pathway towards a concrete pilot. CRAFT seeks to raise approximately $520 million to launch its first fund through a mix of commercial equity, concessional equity, and grant financing to support its pilot. And those of you who might come to COP next week already, we will have a number of events where we will also have the proponents from CRAFT speak and the proponents from Climate Investor One and from other lab instruments speaking to really share some of their innovative solutions, show how they have managed to address some of the barriers in the markets, but also share what are the challenging of really replicating and scaling some of these ideas. Crafted Climate Investor 1, as I said, are just 2 examples of the 19 instruments that have been supported and endorsed by CPI's global and regional innovation labs so far. But I hope that I've managed to illustrate the success and the enormous potential of innovative financing instruments to help address the significant gaps in the current climate finance landscape. And so with this, let me thank you very much for your time and attention during this presentation. I do apologize. I know there was a lot of information, and I'm obviously very happy to answer all your questions, both regarding the landscape of climate finance, the lab, or any other work we do. And as I said, I'd be also happy to be in touch after this webinar if you have any specific questions for that. But with that, let me just close here and stop for a minute to take some questions.
All right. Thanks very much, Barbara, for this really insightful presentation. And I guess there are a lot of questions. So actually, I would just let the audience jump right into it. My colleague Anna, who will just join me right now, has a number of questions from all you who were watching.
Aha, so I'm here. So I was actually talking to you on the chat. So hi, nice to see you in person. And I have several questions for you, Barbara. People were really engaged. And the first one, I think I may throw you like a couple and then a couple more or something like this. So I have Lucas asking, how are the investments distributed among the global south and north? And then I have another question from Adrian, who asks how much of this investment goes to small island developing states. What do you think?
Okay, should I get started immediately on this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I will have some more from you later.
Oh, I'm sure that there will be. I'm sure that there will be more. No, again, and thank you so much for the questions. And maybe just like before I go into the answers to these questions, I think I'd just like to also do a few caveats here, which I have not done, I think, in my presentation, which is basically to say what we do in the landscape is we really bring together data and make data comparable from a number of existing data sources, including the OECD. We have direct service with multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, but we also do our own kind of data gathering from sources like OECD, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and others. What we have seen there, obviously, is that there still are a number of data availability gaps as well, and there's also some of the issues on really, you know, the data that we are able to kind of have in our most comprehensive overview in the landscape. It depends obviously on some of the categories of the sources that we are using, and so sometimes it is not that easy to really understand where exactly the money is ending up, because just some of the data sources that we use are not really you know, tracking that, for example, small island states or other of the overall kind of flows that we have there. So I think with that, what we have seen is that we estimate just generally, if you look at the flows where they're going to, what we estimate is that about 12% of the total flows go from OECD to non-OECD countries during the 2015-2016 period. In the non-OECD regions, we have seen that the East Asia and the Pacific remain the largest destinations for climate finance, with about 32% on average for this period over 2015 and 2016. This was a marked increase from the previous period, actually, was an increase by 24%. And we also saw a very large rise in South Asian flows, which increased by 48% over a time frame and now reach about 22 billion. So I think this is kind of as granular as we can go with the current data set that we have been able to put together. But certainly we can try to look a little bit deeper and see whether we can be coming up with some more indications if there are some specific requests after this webinar here.
Great, thanks, Barbara. I'm sure you reply to their questions. And we have a lot of people normally watching from Asia and Pacific, so that will be very interesting from them.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I have a question from Alana from the Philippines, who says, in the event of a downturn in the economy, are there safeguards to the commitments of climate finance coming from the global north? And how did the 2018 global recession affect climate finance? 2008.
Like, are we already into it?
No, I'm like, whoa, suddenly we have
that went well. That went quick.
Yeah, so maybe you can answer this one, and then Adrian is asking as well, how much of this investment is going to ecosystem-based segments? So maybe with your data that you were giving on different like water and issues like this, maybe you have data on ecosystem things.
Right. So all very, very good questions. I think general on the safeguards, obviously there is the general kind of 100 billion figure that developed countries have committed to in the context of the UN negotiations. I do think, what we've seen again in the years of tracking data over since 2011, and I think as I've shown you for the first time today with our kind of trend analysis, that the public finance has stayed very much constant and steady. So I think that there are kind of some general kind of commitments that are being certainly kind of translated into concrete action from the governments here. I have not looked into specific kind of safeguards that could be used to kind of make sure that if there is a downturn that there will be more investments. But I think what we have seen is that the fall in technology costs in any case helps to make the investments into climate action much more profitable. So the trends that have been very constant with public sector contributing, being the engine behind kind of unlocking larger figures of private investment have been pretty constant over the last 5 years, and the private sector really increasing investments again have been also kind of a constant trend. So I think for me, what is more important than seeing whether there is any specific safeguards regarding the 100 billion figures, which obviously is an extremely important starting point. I do think what I've tried to show is also that it's not enough in per se. What if we really want to get on a 2 degrees pathway, we need much more than the 100 billion. So the 100 billion is a starting point, but what we need to do is really to come up with the right policy frameworks and with the right incentives and the right financial vehicles that really can allow us to scale up investments and allow us to get on this kind of a sustainable pathway. So I think this is what we really should be focusing on, and I think there have been lots of trends that I also try to share in this presentation that give some cause for optimism that lots is ongoing, and really making sure that we are trying to kind of redirect some of the flows into more sustainable flows going forward, whatever happens with the global economy. From the recession, we have actually, if you look at I showed before the trends in the trends on the over the last 5 years, what you could see is that there was a dip in 2013 from kind of figures in 2012. We could see that there was kind of some kind of relation to the recession that we could see there, that there was just in general less investments. But you also could see that once there was kind of a better understanding again of the overall technology costs and of the falling technology costs and of the opportunities that actually are available also connected to climate action, that there was a pretty big increase again. And I think that is something, if you just look over the last few years, which kind of continues to be pretty much constant. So I think that is something that, again, for me, the fact also that the public sector now shifts priorities towards sectors that really need more of the public, kind of capital to take off some of the risks that the private sector isn't yet ready to take, like going more into energy efficiency, like going more into sustainable transport. I think this is all very positive in the sense of making sure that the public sector tries to kind of take into account how to use its overall public money most effectively.
Thank you, Barbara. And I think you are actually replying to my next question, Lucas, but maybe you want to add something else. So Lucas was asking, what can we do to enhance investments among the private sector? And then we had some questions about the lab. People got really excited about the lab.
Great. I'm very excited about the lab too.
Yeah.
Yes. So
questions. Let me just quickly say that people asking if you are doing activities in the Caribbean and how can people partner with you or like send ideas. So maybe you can quickly comment on that as well.
Sure, and again, a great question. So I'm happy that people are excited about as much as I'm excited about that. I think so. How to get the private sector involved. I think what we have learned in our work, we started out by really trying to understand first what are the barriers that keep money from flowing into climate action. Because obviously, if you want to, address the barriers, if you want to come find solutions, then you really need to understand how to, what is wrong and what keeps money from going into climate action. So we have in our work identified 3 types of barriers. One is around policy, and I mentioned that briefly, that really we see it also from our work that the majority of investments originate and are spent in the same country. So that there is a really kind of investors needs very strong policy environments. They need to be comfortable with their policy environments to do the right investments. And we've seen that actually, as I said, like more than almost 80% of this, the latest studies, overall climate finance flows are domestic, and that really kind of shows the need for having good policy enabling environments and domestic settings. So I think this is the first gap that needs to be addressed. It's even stronger for the private sector. I think the second barrier, the second gap that we've seen is around knowledge. Very often investors are not aware about the opportunities that are offered by climate technologies. Again, as I said, the technology costs of a number of renewable energy technologies have fallen considerably. So they are competitive in most markets with fossil fuel technologies, but it's still a knowledge that is not yet accessible to all the investors. And at the same time, they very often also do not take into account the risks that are related to traditional investments, which obviously could have an impact on their kind of business going forward. So there is a barrier that hinders more money from flowing, which is really related to knowledge. And this is, I think, why some of the initiatives that I mentioned around disclosure are so important, to make sure that there is a better awareness amongst investors about what are the risks, but also what are the opportunities in the climate space. And then the third one is what actually is the lab. So it's a nice entry point into the lab questions as well. The third, and I think what we have seen in our work, certainly one of the most important barriers from keeping particularly private investment from flowing into climate action, is that there is still a large number of at least perceived risks related to climate technologies, but also kind of related to some of the policy risks around going into certain sectors or going into certain countries, and also kind of some financial risks of not having enough liquidity in the market. So what this was basically the reason why we kind of helped develop the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which really is focused on developing financial solutions that can address the different types of risks that are persistent to the different types of markets and sectors, and that really can come up with some replicable and scalable business models that ideally will be able to kind of incubate it in the lab, but then hopefully will be replicated and around the world. And maybe just to give you one other example about which I'm very excited about, which is also from our first lab cycle, the energy savings insurance, which is currently being piloted in 7 Latin American countries already, and where we actually have managed to receive funding approval also from the Green Climate Fund for one of the pilots, and where now the Agence Française de Développement is actually starting to replicate the same instrument in 3 other countries in Asia. And I think this is exactly what we would like to do with the lab, come up with a business model that can be then replicated, that we incubate, we help develop, but then it's been replicated by others who really have more of the kind of funding and the kind of implementation expertise. So to the lab, what you can do, I'm not sure whether my slides I still shared on the last slide. I did share the website of the lab. It's climatefinancelab.org. On that website, you can obviously learn more about the lab and the various ideas that we have been developing, but you can also submit your idea. And I really would urge you to, if you have thoughts, or if you know other colleagues that have been thinking about different types types of, financial solutions. It can be from, we've had financial foreign exchange risk hedging instruments. We've had project preparation development facilities. We've had, a number of kind of activities in climate smart lending, in agriculture. We had like different types of platforms that really allow better access to finance for farmers. So I think it's a very wide range of solutions that we've been trying to develop. But if you have ideas, then please look at our website and submit an idea. The call for ideas will be open through the end of COP till November 28th. And we really kind of depend on, the submissions to make sure that we kind of continue to innovate and to develop really promising solutions to help scale this. And as regards the Caribbean, so at the moment we have some links in the lab through the Inter-American Development Bank, which is one of the lab members, but we have not yet really applied one of the instruments there, but certainly would welcome kind of some more engagement there, or like ways to share what we've learned in the lab and see what could be applied in the Caribbean as well.
Great, thanks, Barbara, and I'm sure they will do, because they were very good. I have two more questions, and I think we should close it after this, because me and you and Andreas can be speaking forever. But
I will be at COP if someone is there. So,
so I will just tell you the last two questions. The first one being, what do you think are the biggest obstacles for developing countries in capturing climate investments, and how can they catch up? And then there's a question about which conflict of interest are observable when private sector jumps into the climate investments, and then how can we move climate finance from fossil fuels to renewable energy? What policies, instruments you have found that are interesting related to that?
Well, I could talk for an hour on these three questions here.
Oh, no.
So let me just start. Sorry, let me start with the last one on the fossil fuels. I think this is like a big question, and again, I think we do hope also through the lab that we will gather ideas on how really to shift some of the investments from kind of some of the current investments, or like from the subsidies into climate relevant investments. I don't think we have a silver bullet yet. I mean, obviously, we all know we need to shift away from the fossil fuel subsidies and like try to come up with like more effective ways. We've done one case study on one approach in Tunisia on Prozol, where they actually managed to kind of change some of the fossil fuel subsidies into subsidies for solar water heaters, and that has been actually pretty successful in really changing the overall way of thinking about subsidies, and like also like working with the government. So I'm happy we have a study on that one, which is also on our website, which I'd be happy to share. But I think this is a big question, and I said certainly for us it is a way of making sure that we actually show that the opportunities for investing in climate technology and in climate action, and the risks that are related to investing in fossil fuel assets, including the stranding, but also wasting basically capital, and like the risks for future generations. So I think it is about finding cases that have worked, coming up with the more innovative solutions that really can shift some of the large investment flows. But I think we will need all your thinking and on how we can actually move there, because I think we are all beyond the kind of big statements that we need to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which we all know, of course. So I think it's time to move towards concrete action. And again, if someone has ideas, I'd be really kind of welcoming submissions to the lab on that one. On conflicts within the private sector, I actually have seen, I think also again, what is stressed by the trends that we've seen in our climate finance landscape over the last years, that it's been very, positive to see that there is a shift in priorities depending on, when the markets get more mature for specific technologies. So again, I think the private sector has come in, particularly in the renewable energy space, where technology costs have been falling. Personally, I do think this is a good thing. Again, we need all the money that is available to address climate change. So for me, it is really, we need all to join forces, and we need to make sure that the public money is used most effectively to really kind of, create the right enabling environments and cover the right kind of areas of risks, more related still to adaptation and others, while the private sector really is able to scale up. So for me personally, you obviously have to be careful that there is that is all being done in a sustainable and in a cautious way. But at least what I've seen is that there is a real genuine interest by many private sector actors on contributing to combat climate change. And again, in light of the needs that we have in our world today, I do think we should welcome that, and we should just think about ways where we can make it more effective. And again, the lab is trying to, convene dialogues between public and private investors and make sure that we understand the needs, but also push back if there is, areas or ways that we think are not correct in general. But I think we need to be really smart in how we can design ways of scaling up investment, and therefore getting us towards a sustainable future. And I think I forgot your third question. I'm sorry. Was there one more?
Yeah, don't worry. It was about how to move from renewable energy to the other way. So from fossil fuel industry to the renewable energy, if there's like policies or practices or examples that are really.
Oh, okay. No, I think that one was actually the one that I tried to address with the Prozol example in Tunisia. I think it was actually the developing country, yeah, so I just it came back to me. Yeah, and so I think, for me, again, developing countries, I also think this is why, in our landscape from the beginning, we have focused on global finance flows. I think we have also done a couple of national landscapes, including one on Indonesia. And I think for us, what is really important to actually highlight how much is happening in developing countries already. We have seen really very strong domestic investments, both from the public and the private sector in developing countries. I think this is something which sometimes is a little bit, kind of obscured by focus on flows from the north to the south. While I think it's so important to really show how much action is already happening and how, targeted some of these actions are already. So I think it is, again, about like sharing lessons of what works to ensure that developing countries have the right knowledge, have the right capacity, building capacity on how you can, for example, implement possibly some of the innovative solutions that come out from the lab, but really working together with the developing countries, the governments, but also the other financial stakeholders in the country, of really making sure that there is the right knowledge about solutions, that there is the technical capacity to implement some of the potential pilot project, but also to really understand, what are the appropriate solutions to translate the national determined contributions into concrete investment plans. So I see lots of opportunities. Again, also in the lab, we've been very lucky to now have more developing countries involved. We just had Rwanda join with the minister representing actually the lab principal, and FONERVO, the Rwanda Climate Fund, being kind of our kind of working partner. And I think that has been extremely, inspiring for us also to see what is happening in countries, but also how we can help to support countries in really building the right knowledge and capacity to kind of to attract the right investment. So happy again to talk more about that. I know I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to stop now, but I do want to thank you again very much for having me here today. And I want to thank, everyone for listening and for the excellent questions that have been posed.
Now, we have to thank you. Thanks for sharing all your insights. And also thanks everyone who watched, who asked questions. And yeah, we're excited to see you at COP in Bonn. And
oh yes,
or just virtually sending questions to any of those. All very welcome. So I think we can stop the webinar here. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening to us. And of course, this is online, so you can rewatch it if you need, or just for anything.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.